The sound of a marriage ending isn't a scream. It is the dry, indifferent scratch of a pen on legal paper, a sound like a dead leaf skittering across a sidewalk. I sat at the kitchen table, a solid oak table I planed, sanded, and varnished with my own 2 hands 30 years ago, watching my wife, Eleanor, sign the divorce papers. She didn't look at the grain of the wood. She didn't look at the coffee stain near the edge that marked the morning we paid off the mortgage. She didn't look at me. She looked at the diamond bracelet on her wrist. It was new. It caught the dull winter light filtering through the window, flashing a brilliance that felt offensive in my modest kitchen. It was a gift from the man she hadn't told me about yet, though I had smelt his cologne, expensive, musky, unfamiliar, on her sweaters for months. She called our paid-off home a shack because it didn't have granite countertops or a wine cellar. She called my pension pennies because it didn't allow for first-class flights to Europe. She looked at my calloused hands, hands that had worked double shifts at the steel mill for 20 years to pay for her mother's cancer treatment, and she saw only failure. She saw dirt that wouldn't wash off. "I need security, Silas," she said, sliding the papers toward me across the smooth oak. Her voice was cold, devoid of the warmth that used to greet me at the door with a hot meal and a kiss. "You're a good man, but you're a poor man. I can't spend the rest of my life clipping coupons and waiting for the water heater to break." She paused, checking her reflection in the darkened window. Gary has a villa in Tuscany. He has investments." I picked up the pen. It felt heavy, like a lead weight. I looked at her, searching for the girl I married in a thunderstorm in 1983. I searched for the woman who held my hand when I was laid off, who told me we could survive anything as long as we were together. She wasn't there. This woman was a stranger wearing my wife's face, hardened by envy and the glossy promises of a man named Gary. I signed. I didn't fight. There is no point in fighting for someone who looks at you like you are a bad investment, a stock that has bottomed out and needs to be dumped. "The eviction is immediate," she said, checking her watch. "The house is listed. Gary's broker is handling it. The proceeds will be split 50-50, meager as they are. You have 24 hours to pack your personal effects." I stood up. My knees popped. I felt old. I felt used. 24 hours, I repeated. "Don't be difficult, Silas," she sighed, standing up and smoothing her skirt. "It's just things." I stood in the hallway of the home I had paid for with my blood and sweat, holding a box of old paperback books, while my wife laughed on the phone in the other room. She was talking to him. She laughed at how easy it was. She didn't know that the dead weight she was kicking to the curb was about to become the heaviest anchor in her life. If you've ever been discarded like trash, only to realize you were the treasure, if you've ever had someone look down on you while standing on the pedestal you built for them, hit that subscribe button. Because what I found in the closet wasn't just a coat, it was a judgment, and the verdict was about to be delivered. I climbed the pull-down stairs to the attic. It was freezing up there, the insulation thin and packed down with age. My breath plumed in the air. I needed a coat. I went to the cedar closet in the corner, the one where we kept the winter gear we rarely used. I pushed aside Eleanor's fur coats, coats I had bought her during the good years, and reached for the back. I pulled out my old wool trench coat. It was a monstrosity, moth-eaten, heavy as a wet blanket, and smelling of cedar and old tobacco. It was charcoal gray, the elbows patched with suede that was peeling. Eleanor had hated this coat. She begged me to throw it out every winter for the last decade. "It makes you look homeless, Silas," she would say, wrinkling her nose. "It's embarrassing." I put it on. It settled onto my shoulders like an old friend. It was heavy, comforting, a shield against the cold draft of the attic and the colder reality downstairs. I shoved my hands into the pockets. I felt for my gloves. I reached into the deep inner pocket on the left side, the one with the torn lining I had stitched up myself with fishing line back in 2013 because we couldn't afford a tailor. My fingers brushed against something stiff, not paper, not fabric, plastic. I frowned. I pulled it out. It was a USB drive, a cheap black thumb drive, the kind they gave away at conferences. But it was wrapped in a layer of silver duct tape, and taped to it was a folded piece of yellow notebook paper. The memory hit me like a physical blow, staggering me back against the chimney breast. I was working IT support for a startup downtown, a chaotic, messy little company run by kids in hoodies.
They ran out of venture capital in 6 months. They went bust. They couldn't pay my final month's wages in cash. The CEO, a kid named Julian who drank too much Red Bull, had looked at me with desperate eyes. "I can't pay you, Silas," he had said, "but I have this. It's crypto, Bitcoin. It's the future, man. Take the wallet." I had taken it because I felt sorry for him. I brought it home. Eleanor had screamed at me for days. "Magic internet money, Silas? You let them pay you in air? We have bills. We have a mortgage. You are useless." To keep the peace, I had taken extra shifts at the warehouse, loading trucks until my back screamed, just to make up the lost wages. I never mentioned the drive again. I had thrown it in the coat lining in a fit of shame and forgotten it, a badge of my own stupidity. I sat down on a dusty trunk. My hands were trembling. I unfolded the notebook paper. The ink was faded but legible. It contained a string of random words: horse, battery, staple, correct. The seed phrase, the key to the vault. I looked at the USB drive. Written on the duct tape in Sharpie was a single line: 1000 BTC. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapping itself in a cage of bone. It couldn't be. It was impossible. I pulled out my old laptop from my bag, a brick of a machine I used for solitaire. I plugged in the drive. It took an agonizing minute to mount. I navigated to a blockchain explorer website. My hands shook so hard I could barely type the public address written on the paper. I had to backspace 3 times. Enter. The screen refreshed. The little spinning wheel turned. And then, there it was. Balance, 1000 BTC. I stared at the number. I blinked. It didn't change. I opened a new tab. I typed Bitcoin price USD. The number that came up made the air leave my lungs. Zeros. I did the math in my head. I did it again. I pulled out my phone and used the calculator because my brain refused to accept the zeros. $70 million. I sat in the freezing attic, surrounded by dust and discarded Christmas decorations, wearing a moth-eaten coat that smelled of failure. And I realized that for 10 years, I had been walking around with the GDP of a small nation in my pocket. I looked at the screen. I looked at the coat. $70 million. Eleanor was downstairs. I could hear her heels clicking on the hardwood. She was packing her designer shoes, complaining to Gary on the phone about how little she would get from the house sale.
She was discarding me like I was the moth-eaten coat. I felt a laugh bubble up in my throat. It was a wild, jagged thing. I didn't scream. I didn't run downstairs and wave the laptop in her face. A cold, hard silence settled over me. It was the silence of a man who has just been handed a loaded gun and knows exactly where to aim it. This wasn't just money. This was a test. And Eleanor? She had failed it. She had failed it spectacularly. I ejected the drive. I wrapped it carefully in the paper. I put it back in the pocket of the coat. I buttoned the pocket shut. I packed the coat carefully into my box of books. I placed it on top, folding the sleeves over the chest like a corpse. I walked downstairs. Eleanor was standing by the door, tapping her foot. She had her coat on, a sleek black cashmere number. She asked, not looking up from her phone, "Gary is sending a truck for my things in an hour. I don't want you here when they arrive." "I'm done," I said quietly. She glanced at the box in my arms. She saw the wool coat on top. She sneered. "Good," she said. "Try not to leave a mess, Silas. I want the open house to go smoothly." I looked at her one last time. I looked at the lines around her mouth, etched by years of dissatisfaction. I saw the greed. I saw the shallowness. I saw the absolute, vacuum-like lack of loyalty. "Goodbye, Eleanor," I said. I walked out the door. I walked out into the snow. The cold air hit my face, but I didn't feel it. The coat was heavy on my shoulders, but the drive burned a hole in my pocket, radiating a heat that warmed me to the bone. I wasn't a poor man anymore. But she didn't need to know that. Not yet. Not until the ink on the divorce decree was dry. Not until the judge's gavel fell. Not until she had legally, irrevocably severed all ties to my poverty and signed away her claim to my future. I climbed into my rusted truck. I turned the key. The engine roared to life. I drove away from the house I built, leaving my wife to wait for her truck, unaware that she had just evicted a king. Waiting for the gavel to fall is like waiting for a storm to break. The air pressure drops, the birds go quiet, and you can feel the electricity humming in your teeth.
6 months had passed since I walked out of my own front door into the snow, carrying a cardboard box and wearing a coat worth $70 million. 6 months of living in a roadside motel that smelled of industrial cleaner and stale cigarettes.
6 months of eating diner food alone, watching the news on a television that only got 3 channels. I played the role of the defeated ex-husband perfectly. I let my beard grow out a little scruffy. I wore the same 3 shirts. I drove my rusted truck. I hadn't touched the money. I hadn't converted a single Satoshi. I hadn't even checked the balance again, terrified that the numbers on the screen had been a hallucination brought on by stress and grief. But every night, I slept with the USB drive taped to my chest, feeling the hard plastic against my skin like a second heartbeat. I needed the divorce to be final. I needed the judge's stamp. I needed the ink to be dry and the file to be closed before I took my first breath of freedom. The final settlement hearing was scheduled for a rainy Tuesday in November. The sky was the color of a bruise, weeping a cold, steady drizzle against the windows of the courthouse. I sat in the conference room, my hands resting on the polished mahogany table. Across from me sat Eleanor. She looked radiant. She was tanned, her skin glowing with the kind of health that only money and Italian sun can buy. She wore a cream-colored suit that probably cost more than my truck, and the diamond bracelet on her wrist caught the fluorescent light, flashing a mocking brilliance. Next to her was her lawyer, Mr. Sterling. He was a shark in a 3-piece suit, sleek and predatory, smelling of expensive cologne and arrogance. And next to him sat Gary. Gary was my age, but he was fighting it with hair plugs and a gym membership he clearly used more for socializing than sweating. He had a leased Ferrari key resting on the table in front of him, a talisman of his success. He smirked at me, a look of pity mixed with disdain. I wore my old cardigan, the elbows worn thin, and a pair of slacks that had seen better days. I looked exactly like what they thought I was, a man with nothing left to lose, because he had nothing left to take. "Let's make this quick," Mr. Sterling said, opening a file with a snap. "We have a flight to catch. Mr. Vance agrees to the expedited sale of the marital home, with a 60-40 split of the proceeds in favor of Miss Vance due to..."
"I have a flight to Paris tonight." "I'll sign," I said. Gary chuckled. "Of course you will. You don't have a choice, pal." "I'll sign," I repeated, ignoring him. Mr. Sterling sighed, checking his watch. "You're in no position to make demands, Mr. Vance. The terms are generous considering your lack of contribution to the lifestyle, miss." "I want a clause added," I said. Eleanor rolled her eyes. "Oh, God." "I want it in writing," I continued, looking directly at the judge who sat at the head of the table, bored and ready for lunch. "We both state, under penalty of perjury, that we have fully disclosed all assets currently in our possession, and we waive any future claim to assets discovered after this date. A clean break, no coming back. Once we sign, the door is closed." Eleanor laughed. It was a harsh, incredulous sound. "Fine, whatever." "Do it," Gary urged. "Let him have his little clause." The paralegal typed it up. The printer hummed in the corner. They mocked me while we waited, whispering to each other and giggling like teenagers. They thought I was protecting my meager pension. They thought I was terrified they would come after my truck. The papers were placed in front of me. I read the clause. Both parties hereby waive all future claims. I picked up the pen. It felt light. I signed, Silas Vance. Eleanor signed, Eleanor Vance. The judge stamped it. Final. The sound of the stamp hitting the paper echoed in the room like a gunshot. It was done. We were divorced. "Finally," Eleanor sighed, standing up and smoothing her skirt. "Goodbye, Silas. Try not to starve." "Wait," I said. I didn't stand up. I reached down into my canvas messenger bag sitting on the floor. "We're done here, Silas," Gary said, standing up and grabbing his keys. I pulled out the old wool coat. It was heavy, smelling of cedar and the ghost of my old life. I placed it on the table. It looked grotesque against the polished wood, a pile of moth-eaten fabric in a room of silk and wool suits. "Ugh," Eleanor asked, wrinkling her nose in disgust.
That disgusting coat. I told you to burn it years ago." "You did tell me to burn it," I said. "But I kept it." I reached into the deep inner pocket. I felt the duct tape. I felt the plastic. I pulled out the USB drive and the folded piece of notebook paper. I reached into my bag again and pulled out my laptop, a battered machine that hummed loudly when I opened it. "What is this?" Gary asked, annoyed now. "This is pathetic."
"Just checking my inventory," I said, "since we have a full disclosure clause." I plugged the drive into the USB port. I connected the laptop to the conference room projector using the HDMI cable I had asked Marcus, my lawyer and old friend who sat silently in the corner, to set up beforehand. The projector hummed to life. A beam of light cut through the room, hitting the screen at the far end. The browser window opened. I typed in the address for the Blockchain Explorer. I typed in the public key from the paper. Enter. The screen refreshed. Balance, 1,000 BTC. 00 USD. The room went silent. It wasn't a quiet silence. It was a vacuum. The air was sucked out of the space instantly. The hum of the projector fan sounded like a jet engine. Eleanor stared at the screen. She blinked. She squinted. She looked at me. She looked back at the screen. "What?" she whispered. Her voice was trembling. "That," I said, my voice steady, cold, and final, "is the payment I got from Julian back in 2013. The magic internet money you screamed at me about. The air you told me to throw away. I kept it in the coat you despised." Gary stood up so fast he knocked his chair over. It clattered to the floor with a deafening crash. 70, he choked out. "Eleanor," she shrieked. She lunged for the table, her hands clawing at the laptop as if she could grab the numbers through the screen. "We were married when you got it. Half of that is mine." "Was," I corrected her. I pointed to the paper on the table. The ink was still wet. "We were married, past tense. As of 5 minutes ago, we are divorced. And you just signed a waiver for all future claims on assets not disclosed in the initial filing. You wanted a clean break, Eleanor. You wanted to make sure I couldn't come after Gary's villa." Mr. Sterling shouted, his face turning red. "He hid assets. This is concealment. We'll sue." "I didn't hide it," I said calmly. I reached into my file folder and pulled out the disclosure form I had submitted weeks ago, the one they had barely glanced at because they were too busy laughing at my poverty. I slid it across the table. 1 wool coat and contents of pockets. "It was right there," I said. "You valued the coat at $10. You didn't check the pockets. You didn't ask." Eleanor collapsed into her chair. She looked like a puppet whose strings have been cut. She looked at Gary. Gary was looking at the screen. Then he looked at Eleanor. The look on his face wasn't love.
It wasn't concern. It was a look of dawning horror. He wasn't looking at a woman he adored. He was looking at a woman who had just cost him the biggest payday of his life. He looked at her like she was a bad investment. "Gary," whispered. The disgust in his voice was palpable. "Silas," she wailed. She turned to me, tears streaming down her face. Ugly, mascara-stained tears of greed and profound loss. "Silas, baby, please, we can fix this. I didn't mean it. The divorce, it was a mistake. I was confused. I was scared about money. I love you, Silas." I stood up. I picked up the old wool coat. I shook it out. I put it on. It felt warm. It felt heavy. It felt like armor plating against the world. "You weren't confused, Eleanor," I said softly. "You were bored. You wanted a villa in Tuscany. You wanted shiny things. Well, Gary has a villa. You should go." "Silas," she screamed, reaching for me, her fingers brushing the rough wool of my sleeve. I stepped back. I walked out of the conference room. Marcus followed me, grinning from ear to ear. "That was cold, Silas," Marcus said in the hallway, clapping me on the shoulder. "No," I said, buttoning the coat all the way to the chin. I walked out of the courthouse and into the rain. The city was gray and wet, but to me, it looked like a painting. I hailed a cab. The driver pulled up, splashing water onto the curb. "Where?" he asked. "The airport," I said. I wasn't going back to the motel. I wasn't going back to the past. I had a lot of world to see. I had a coat with deep pockets, and for the first time in my life, I could afford the view. Behind me, through the closing doors of the courthouse, I could still hear my ex-wife screaming at her lawyer, a high, thin sound of regret that faded into the noise of the city, irrelevant and distant as a bad memory.